Hi, I'm Reed, and today we're talking about them weird psychic catfish lads from the dawn of time, Aboleths. Welcome to Monstering, our series on how to take creatures, threats, and enemies from D&D lore, customize them to our own campaigns. This is Crowland Publishing. Let's get to it. Before we really get into Aboleths and what they are and how you can use them in your game, I would like to tell you a story. When I was very young, 7 or 8, I was on a boat and I was using a hand reel and fishing just with my family. And I caught something. I remember thinking quite heavy and thinking, in the way that a young man will, a young child will. Wow, I've got a big fish here. This is going to be fantastic. And very, very excitedly, I pulled it up out of the water and I realized what I had was a stingray. I don't know how big it was, but in my mind and how I remember it, it must have been as tall as me. However tall a 7-year-old is. And I didn't know what to do. I sort of was in a bit of a panic state, so I was just keep pulling it up. Even though I was scared of it and I didn't really want it near me, and as it came up out of the water, it rose up, and beneath the manta shape was gills opening and closing, and eyes that could see me, making that sucking sound as it desperately suffocated. And I was terrified. I dropped the reel and away it went, presumably to a long and happy stingray life. But I've never forgotten that, to me, vast form coming up out of the water, the gills, the sounds, the terror at something that I had summoned up from some primeval depth. And to me, that's what an aboleth is. Now, aboleths in D&D lore are, as we've said, they are giant fish monsters. They live in the water. They can breathe air for short amounts of time. They're in league with the elder evils, which are the Lovecraftian monstrosities from the dawn of time. Often their backstory is that they were cast down along with the elder evils, and now in the dark places of the earth, beneath the ocean waves in ancient caverns, they plot and they plan using their vast mental powers. Slowly but surely they turn their plans against us. And they plan to have it all back. They want it back. They want the earth restored to what it was in those ancient days when they ruled, and vast monstrous tentacular things were as huge as mountain ranges. And that is some of the most interesting things about aboleths, is that they come from a sort of milieu of fantasy that's very, very rare, which is that things exist on a geological time scale. If you say a dragon is 10,000 years old, that's a very old dragon. It sounds antique. But an aboleth is 10 million years old, beyond any scale of human understanding. And more importantly, when they reproduce, the young born with all the memories of that parent, and of course that aboleth had the memories of that parent, and so on. So an aboleth might very well have a pretty good memory of the entire geological ages of the world. So interesting chaps to talk to. So aboleths are actually a pretty great monster, stat-wise and lore-wise. So how can we rethink them and reuse them in our own campaigns? One of the first things I like to do when pondering just this very question is to go back to the mythology and the folklore and the pop culture surrounding these kinds of creatures. And aboleths don't really have any mythology or folklore. They're creatures of the game. They were designed for use in the game, and they owe their antecedents to pulp fiction and weird tales, i.e. the fantasy and horror of the 1920s and the 1930s. Your Lovecrafts and your Clark Ashton Smiths and your Robert Howards. You should get used to those names if you haven't heard them before, because, well, talking about them a bit as we redo monsters. And they tended to view these creatures as quite alien, be that literally aliens to the world that have come down in spacecraft, or interdimensional invaders that have come here, tossed up from the gates of hell, from some primordial world, or just elsewhere. But there are a few interesting examples that I think that we can really pull from for this. Clark Ashton Smith, who is one of my great favourites. I like him as a writer more than I like Lovecraft and Howard even. And he did a fantastic story called The Beast of Avignon, which is that medieval France suffers an invasion by an alien. And it's not so much the alien that's useful to us, or even the setting. It's the way that people deal with something that is outside their own mythology. They know all along that it's not a werewolf, it's something else. So that's a great story, and you should have a read of it. The Logor from Colin Wilson. He wrote a few Lovecraftian stories and novels in his career. And the Logor, whose name has been repurposed for a lot of really cool stuff. They are weird psyche aliens who they're sort of the basis for Loch Ness Monster. So you've even got a aquatic lair to put them in. The really interesting thing about those is the way that they think. They're deeply cynical, deeply nihilistic, deeply pessimistic creatures. Very cool. If you remember Star Control, the old video game, the Urquan, I think they were called the Urquan Dominators or something. They're pretty cool example. Even the Reapers from the first Mass Effect game, Harbinger or Sovereign or whatever he's bloody called. The big weird psychic spaceship. The thing that turns your friends against each other and against you, and then slowly reveals itself. Great example. Gahoon from World of Warcraft, who is a sort of experiment that's been made from the horrible stuff of the old gods, and imprisoned, and even imprisoned, it manages to turn a culture into bizarre, horrible cannibals. Definitely have a look at that. What's his name? Nero Wolfe. Nero Wolfe was a detective. And he was too fat to leave his house. He was too much of a fan of eating that he just refused to ever go out the front door. So he had his little mate called Archie, who would actually do all the legwork for him. And you could do like a very interesting campaign where you are actually working for an aboleth in that respect. It can't leave its pond. It can't reveal itself to the world. Maybe it's the world's one good aboleth, or maybe it's just an aboleth whose goals coincide with yours for now. And you're doing the legwork for it. And I think that as they are now, I think that aboleths really just need to be more important in the backstory, or at the very least, you need to cement them as important creatures, because they do bring with them this backstory of millions and millions of years. Because of their horrible alien bodies, your players probably will link them with more alien forms of life and more cosmic grandeur. I have often made them actually sort of the great young ones, the larval forms of these Lovecraftian old ones and alien super beings. And the aboleths have just been waiting on Earth to grow, and now is their chance. I think that you really do need to make aboleths have a plan, have a good plan, have a strong chance of succeeding in that plan, and really show that there are consequences to going up against aboleths as well. So how are your players directly dealing with an aboleth? How are they going to encounter it? First things first, you need to understand that aboleths are not going to come onto the campaign directly on screen, as it were, without a lot of foreshadowing. Otherwise, it's just a big fish monster. You need to have isolated communities that have been warped by it mentally. Perhaps they're now insane cannibals. Perhaps they just worship it as a god. Perhaps a beautiful wealthy seaside town has been slowly coming under its influence for a generation or two, so you can get there before it's all gone too far wrong. Because there's a few powers that we need to talk about here. And one of the first ones is called probing telepathy, which is that it can open a mental channel with you and talk to you and presumably hear your thoughts. You would have to do a bit of a ruling about that. I would say that you would have to want to talk to the aboleth. It's controlling your mind through that channel is a different power. And one of the other powers is indeed enslave, which is a very powerful charm. You get one chance to resist it, and if you don't, you have to wait until the aboleth is dead or on another plane or travel quite some far way away before you can try and save again and escape its mental control. And when you do finally meet them, they're big. They've got some pretty good tentacle attacks and some body attacks, but the way that you as a DM really want to use it, the way that you really want to use an aboleth is you must make it disgusting to fight. You must emphasize that what your PCs are doing is horrific to them. Now, usually you meet an aboleth in a pool of slimy water or in an ancient freezing cold cave or somewhere remote and dark and dank and horrible. Aboleths must, as all creatures, as all boss monsters must, will have minions. It will have mutated slaves who cannot breathe in air for very long, so they're continuously their gills are going. They're insane. They've been down here in the dark with this monstrous thing for maybe their entire lives. Maybe their grandparents were born here. So already you've got to deal with these ghastly parodies of human beings. Then it's going to have things like mutated sharks, mutated seals, even any kind of sea creature, sea elves, Sahagwin, what are the aquatic trolls called? Mero. You could use any kind of creature, really, any kind of humanoid creature to represent a particularly mutated slave. A big one bred for size and strength. You could use an ogre's stats. And then, I think the piece de resistance, the things that players will remember when it comes to knockdown, drag out, fight, if the aboleth gets its mucus on you, it can mutate you. And it can turn you into one of those hideous air-breathing or water-breathing creatures. And the fun thing about that is that when it mutates you, you can't breathe air for more than about an hour before you have to go back to the water. So it just keeps you an hour away from any other water. And I would actually rule that you even need to breathe the aboleth slimy water, but that's a personal thing. So you can never escape it. Your choices are horribly, horribly drown or serve. And you will serve because it will enslave you. Make players remember the aboleth encounter by playing up that mutating, slimy, acidy body horror. The tentacles grab you, pull you in. The creatures drag you into the watery slime hole and pit that the aboleth is wallowing around in, writhing huge tentacles, and your hand goes in and it comes out silvery, acidic. Maybe it's even got fish scales or the paleness of a toad's belly. It's just you're changed, and the tentacles get around you, wrap you up. You feel it happening. Just it should be horrible, and that is the way to play an aboleth. Do not make it just a fish monster. Do not make it just it hits you with the tentacles. Play up that this is gross, that this is awful, and that this is not an encounter that any PC, that any player character would ever want to experience. Aboleths are gross and horrible and big and cruel as well. They are sadistic. So, once you're done fighting the aboleth, you got to think about how it thinks. I think aboleths are eternally old beyond human reckoning. Just, it has slept through the entirety of human civilization and woken up the same way that you might wake up in the morning and find that there are ants on your front door. It doesn't even hate us. It just thinks that we're stupid idiots, that we're disgusting, that we're just like pointlessly short lives in the service of the gods who it hates, who it remembers, maybe even personally remembers, overthrowing the great elder evils that were superb, beautiful monstrosities of horror. It hates the demons. It remembers the world before the abyss. It hates everything. It thinks everything is stupid and vulgar and pointless next to abolethic life. It's probably not going to want to communicate with humans very much. I always imagine that its heart's desire is just, it sort of reaches in and activates your pleasure centers of your brain rather than knowing, oh, you desire the beauteous touch of Matthew the Handsome. I can have that happen. It doesn't know what Matthew the Handsome is. It probably barely even understands human romance and ritual courting. So it probably will just construct a memory to talk to you. So that I would imagine that when you first meet an aboleth, or an aboleth becomes aware of you, it takes something from your mind and puts it on its hand. And it's like putting a glove on its hand so that it doesn't have to get dirty. So that you begin to dream about, your mother comes to you and says, do you remember the first days when we and the fellow elves moved to the village? How beautiful it was. Don't you want things to be like that was again? Well, why are you working with humans? Why are you working with dwarves? And then slowly you begin to realize that your memory person, your whoever is coming to you in your memory, is kind of cold and cruel and threatening. And then slowly, eventually, you begin to figure it out. You're not my mum, and the image rips away, and there's the aboleth, like, come to me, serve. The other thing that you could do is either have it so that it's so disgusted by humans and by PC races that it just refuses to talk. If it has to talk, yes, no, slave. But then again, you could go a different way, and perhaps an aboleth is actually incredibly genius, loquacious. It enjoys talking to you in the same way that you might enjoy talking to a child who you plan to mutate into a fish monster. So I think another way to deal with aboleths is that let it be talking to the players for a little while. Give it a session or two where it's taunting them and teasing them and appearing in their dreams. And they begin to not sleep very well. They begin to suffer from sort of symptoms of mental illness, from depression and anxiety and real sleeplessness and psychotic breaks where they're not sure if what they're hearing is real. Of course it is, but they might not know that. They might be wandering around in memories of trauma that the aboleth has found and dug up and is just taunting them with, like a cruel son of a bitch. So that's the key, I think, with aboleths. They just think that we're such gross scum. It's washing its tentacles after it's dealt with us. So that's how players will encounter aboleths on the field, and that's what aboleths will think about players. What my players think about aboleths. What can characters know about aboleths? And you should allow certain laws to tell your players something about monsters they're fighting. They invested in those skills for a reason. They want to know these things. As ever, there's 4 important laws in D&D 5e that will help with the monsters, specifically with aboleths. Religion. Aboleths should have an important part in the backstory of your world if you're going to use them. Religion might tell people there were these things called aboleths. They were from the dawn of time. No, they're obviously all extinct. They can't have existed. This is from back when the gods first appeared. But they did exist, but they're a boogeyman. So that's what religion might know. Arcana. Arcana usually tells about what kind of powers the creatures have. So They have psychic powers. They have mutating powers. A good roll will be able to tell more. They often, turn people into slave races. That would be a 15 plus of success. Nature. I tend to think that any sort of nature law should give you just a basic rundown. Aboleths are ancient, big, fat catfish monsters with psychic powers who live in the water. Anything else, I think, would have to be to do with a player's specific character. I'm an aberrant specialist. I hunt them. You would be able to know more. And history law. I think that you should have to sort of qualify what that law is specifically about. Is it ancient? Is it modern? Is it whatever? But if you do have an ancient law, you probably know that there was something called the Aboleths. They were around for a long time. But they're not real. They died off a long time ago, right? Talked a fair bit about the yes, master aspects of Aboleths and it's the god in the lake that you run across the cult performing sacrifices to, but here is a few other plot hooks that maybe you as a DM could use or that you as a player might take to your DM. Have you ever seen or read the book for number 1, Needful Things? A man comes to town. He has a wonderful shop with magical items just for you that resonate on a very deeply personal level with people. You can have them, all it costs is your soul. An aboleth either wears a human as a skin suit or has a specialty mutated slave who has bought up a whole bunch of treasures from the aboleth's lair and is slowly but surely corrupting the souls of a town. The PCs come along just in time. Fun way to then launch into an investigation for the aboleth. Number 2. Around the area that you've been operating in your party, you begin to see there's kinds of rune stones, which you should go look up if you don't know because they're amazing. But they're much older than the usual type. They're much, much older. They're from a kind of stone that is usually only found beneath mountains. And they seem to be representing that under the hill, the Black Hill, that has such a terrible reputation in folklore, something was imprisoned long, long ago. Something that was imprisoned with a very great deal of magical power. And of course, it's either an aboleth prison or an aboleth workshop, or it's just been down there for a very, very long time. And it's been doing its own thing and you go and wake it up. A small seaside town for number 3 has a reef just a few hundred feet offshore. Dark reef. An aboleth lives there, hiding from the shadows, and it's been slowly but surely turning the town into a Lovecraftian Deep One, Shadow over Innsmouth cult who's growing up around it, and it's mutating people slowly but surely, and it's getting sacrifices. And maybe your players come from that town. Maybe it's a whole hometown heroes thing. Maybe you're just visiting a friend. Maybe there's a scholar in town. So you step into this once thriving town. Now it's just a place where people with weird nictating eyes and bulbous creepy growths on their neck who just creep you out. And then sooner or later they're going to drag you off and feed you to the aboleth. So that's fun. Number 4, you're playing an Underdark campaign. Maybe you're Dark Elves, maybe you're Sverfneblin, maybe you're whatever. And an aboleth reaches out to you, finds you maybe through its slaves and says, I need your help. I want you to be a patron of mine or a client of mine. I need your help against various kinds of enemies. So obviously you've got to think of something that an aboleth fears. Are they gonna smart players will actually go and find the aboleth's enemy, because generally there's not much worse than an aboleth, but it could be fun. Because an aboleth is gonna know a lot of things, so it could say, I know what the High Priestess of Lolth most wishes in all the world. I know what the Elder Brain wants. So it could be a really useful ally for a bit. And number 5, you find a sick and dying aboleth somehow. And it tells you where the treasures are, but it needs you to do something for it. It needs to live in your mind for some time. It needs to transfer its consciousness, and it promises you promises you, and you can read its mind. It lets you. It won't take over your mind. It could be fun for a Warlock patron too. But you can either start off a PC with this bargain already made. It's hard to know with your party if they're all going to go like, no, that sounds terrible, we would never do that. Or they're all going to go, yes, I would love to do that. Or if you've got the kind of party where you think that this will score a hit, do it. Because the idea, then you get to keep the Aboleth around, and, you get to have one of your better role players in the party suddenly break out with the destroy its mind. No, wait, I didn't mean destroy the mind. So that'd be a bit of fun. So, alright then, Aboleths, ancient Lovecraftian monsters from the dawn of time. Hopefully you found some ways to utilize them in your campaign. You found some resources to get you to think about them a bit more thoroughly, and some ideas of how to use them better in your world. You know how YouTube works, the liking, the killiking, the subscribing, and all that silly nonsense. I'm Christian, we're Crowland Publishing. See you next time.